Alright guys, so today we're going to go over the addendum for property subject to mandatory membership in a property owners association. Really long form name, but basically it's the HOA addendum. So we're going to jump through this. It shouldn't take too long. As usual, we'll read through each section and then go back and we'll hit the highlights for each one. So the very first thing I want to point out is going to be the name of the form. It's very long. We usually just refer to it as the HOA addendum, but right underneath the name of the form, it clearly states in parentheses, not for use with condominiums. So if you're going to be doing a condo contract, you do not have to include an HOA addendum. The reason being is that all the information contained in this addendum, for the most part, is already inside of the condo contract, so you don't have to duplicate it out. It would be conflicting and just wouldn't make any sense. Underneath that, you're going to go ahead and put in the street address for the home or the unit that you're purchasing, and then underneath that you have to put the name of the property owner association and phone number. You can't just put one, you got to put both, all right, so that people know how to reach out and contact them. If you're not sure, okay, there's this little thing that we have called Google. You can jump on Google and look for the homeowners association. If you are the listing agent and you're not sure who it is, go look at some of the other listings in that area. If you still can't figure it out, call the listing agents in those areas that have sold homes and see if you can get information from them. So that's the first part. The first section, A, is the subdivision information section. It reads as follows. Subdivision information, in quotes, means 1, a current copy of the restrictions applying to the subdivision and bylaws and rules of the association, and 2, a resale certificate, all of which are described by section 207.003 of the Texas Property Code. So it's important to remember that the subdivision information is both of these things. It is not just a resale certificate, and it's not just the CC&Rs or the restrictions, it's everything. So you have to be able to provide both of those in order to be in compliance with this. If you only provide one, that doesn't count. All right, so just getting the resale certificate without getting the HOA stuff doesn't count, and getting the HOA stuff without a current resale certificate also doesn't count. So make sure that you're providing both. Then we have 4 options here that are somewhat similar. It just divvies up who pays for what. So the first section says, within blank days after the effective date of the contract, seller shall obtain, pay for, and deliver the subdivision information to the buyer. If seller delivers the subdivision information, buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after buyer receives the subdivision information or prior to closing, whichever occurs first, and the earnest money will be refunded to buyer. If buyer does not receive the subdivision information, buyer, as buyer's sole remedy, may terminate the contract at any time prior to closing, and the earnest money will be refunded to buyer. So this is really important because there's a couple of requirements here. First of all, you have however many number of days to provide it. If you put too little days, so if you're on the listing side and you put like 5 days and you haven't even started the process, remember it can take a while to get your resale certificate or a full copy of the restrictions and bylaws and everything else. So if you don't give yourself enough time and you don't provide it within 5 days, that buyer can terminate the contract at any time before closing, all right, if you don't provide it. Now, if you do provide it, they still have 3 days to review all that information to decide whether they want to continue forward. So if you're on the buyer's side, this is going to be really important because once you have both the HOA rules and restrictions, regulations, bylaws, all that stuff, and the resale certificate, you have 3 days to review that with your buyer to see whether they want to continue or not. If, for example, it's really important that they can park an RV or do something like that, and the restrictions say you can't do that, or maybe they say you can only park a 20-foot one, but theirs is 30 feet, this would be your chance to review those and make sure that you are taking care of your buyer. Now, as agents, we don't provide legal advice on restrictions inside the CC&Rs or anything else like that. You are going to want to read through those, though, to help provide information, but you're just going to want to point it out to your client, let them go read it for themselves and make their own decisions. All right? So again, really, really important that you comply with the time requirements here. The second section, or paragraph A2, if you will, says within blank number of days after the effective date of the contract, buyer shall obtain, pay for, and deliver a copy of the subdivision information to the seller. If buyer obtains the subdivision information within the time required, buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after buyer receives the subdivision information or prior to closing, whichever occurs first, and the earnest money will be refunded to buyer. If buyer due to factors beyond buyer's control, is not able to obtain the subdivision information within the time required, buyer may, at buyer's sole remedy, terminate the contract within 3 days after the time required or prior to closing, whichever occurs first, and the earnest money will be refunded to buyer. So this is similar, but also very different. The whole goal is to get the subdivision information over to the buyer, but in this case, the buyer is paying for it, all right? And the buyer has to deliver that to the seller, all right? They have to deliver a copy of it. Now, this section provides that if the buyer doesn't get the information and it's not due to their fault, it's not factors beyond their control, all right, that they can terminate. So what are factors beyond their control? Well, you could say that if the HOA takes 2 weeks to get it, that might be outside of their control. But you could also argue that if you gave them 10 days and they waited till the 10th day to order it, that could also be a problem. Maybe that was within their control. Maybe they should have ordered it the day of. So if your seller is not wanting to pay for the information, or you have a buyer and the seller doesn't want to pay for it, the buyer can pay for it. That's fine to get the information. They also have the ability to terminate, though. And then you have A3, which says buyer has received and approved the subdivision information before signing the contract. Buyer does or does not require an updated resale certificate. If buyer requires an updated resale certificate, seller at buyer's expense shall deliver it to buyer within 10 days after receiving payment for the updated resale certificate from buyer. Buyer may terminate this contract and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer if seller fails to deliver the updated resale certificate within the time required. So in this case, you already have, if you're the seller, you already have a resale certificate, you already have a copy of all the HOA rules and bylaws and everything else, you have a complete set of subdivision information. You are providing that to the buyer ahead of time and saying, here you go, and they're signing off that they've received it and they approved of it. However, they can choose to either request or not request an updated resale certificate. If they don't want an updated one, then no big deal. They've signed off on it. They have it. Too bad, so sad if they don't like something that they find later on. But if they do request an updated resale certificate, all right, seller gets to order it. It's going to be the buyer that pays for it, all right, and it has to be delivered within 10 days after they receive the payment from the buyer, all right. If they provide it, buyer may terminate. Right? Only if the seller fails to deliver it, though. So in this case, they are basically A3 is them signing off on all the rules and restrictions. The only thing that they're waiting on is an updated resale certificate. And it's not, oh, we got the updated resale certificate and we're not happy with it. It is simply, we got it. It is what it is. If it's not delivered, though, then they can terminate. And then A4 simply says buyer does not require delivery of the subdivision information, meaning they're not asking for it. So I'm going to tell you, both as an agent, as a broker, as an educator, and as a buyer, there is literally zero reason that I can think of where you would not, select 1, 2, or 3. Option 4 is saying you don't get a copy of the subdivision information, no resale certificate, which isn't even the most important thing in my mind. It's the restrictions, CC&Rs, bylaws, rules, and everything else. If your buyer is buying inside of an HOA, all right, they need to have a copy of the rules prior to closing so they can make sure that there's nothing they want to do, all right, that they can't do under those rules. Even if they say, no big deal, we don't care, that's fine. But you know what? Buyers hardly ever tell you everything that's going on in their mind about what they're going to do with the property. And you don't want them to call you 3 months after you close and say, Patrick, we wanted to build a fence out of cedar, and it looks like you can't build a fence out of cedar, and that's our favorite kind of fence wood, and we really want to do that, and we're really pissed off because we didn't know that. Why didn't you tell us we couldn't build a fence out of cedar? And my response would be, well, you didn't tell me that that's what you want to do. Well, yeah, but we wanted to do that. Why didn't we get a copy of the HOA restrictions so that we knew that? All right? Zero reason that you wouldn't want your buyers to have that. So at that point, it just becomes the decision on who pays for it. The seller pays for it, the buyer pays for it, or the seller already has it and the buyer's good with that, or they want an updated resale certificate. But it should always be 1, 2, or 3 so that we're making sure the buyer gets a copy of those. As a listing agent, you also want to do 1, 2, or 3 because you want to make sure that your seller is providing that to the buyer so the buyer can never come back and accuse you guys of not providing information that they were entitled to. Sounds simple, sounds pretty common sense, but common sense isn't very common. So now, underneath paragraph A, in nice big bold print, we have this phrase: the title company or its agent is authorized to act on behalf of the parties to obtain the subdivision information only upon receipt of the required fee for the subdivision information from the party obligated to pay. So what this means is that the title company has the authority to order these documents on your client's behalf, either the seller or the buyer, but only after they get a copy of the fee. Receipt a copy of the fee, either that you paid directly to the HOA or you bring them a check so that they can be reimbursed for that. So title companies will often order this stuff, but not always. You just want to make sure you verify with your title company. All right. Moving on to paragraph B, material changes, reads as follows. If seller becomes aware of any material changes in the subdivision information, seller shall promptly give notice to buyer. Buyer may terminate the contract prior to closing by giving written notice to seller if 1. Any of the subdivision information provided was not true, or 2. Any material adverse change in the subdivision information occurs prior to closing and the earnest money will be refunded to buyer. So this is really designed for somebody like, let's say you provide them all the information. Let's just say you have an 8-week closing, and 4 weeks in, the HOA met, they had a meeting, and they voted to change a bunch of rules. All right, maybe they want to change the fence material that you can use. Maybe they want to change the way houses look. Pick anything you want. If they decide to change the rules, all right, the seller is under an obligation to update the buyer about those changes so that the buyer can have a chance to decide whether they still want to proceed or not. All right. Section C says fees. A little confusion here, so we'll go over this in more detail. Except as provided by paragraph A, D, and E, buyer shall pay any and all association fees or other charges associated with the transfer of the property not to exceed blank number of dollars, and seller shall pay any excess. So in this case, the dollar amount you're putting in here is limiting the amount of money that the buyer will pay to transfer into this, because the HOA is just like the government, has to get their piece of the pie. And so every time you sell a piece of property inside of an HOA, there are going to be transfer fees associated with that. In this case, this amount of money put into paragraph C is going to limit how much the buyer pays, because at the end it says seller shall pay any excess. What I normally like to do, just because it's fair and easy, is I'll just put 50-50 in there, 50-50. So buyer pays half, seller pays the other half. Now, in a we cross out the dollar sign. So you can, in a multiple offer situation, decide, I'm the buyer, I'll pay 500 of it, but you're gonna want to know exactly what that amount is, because let's just say it's $2,000, $500 isn't all that much, and the seller's gonna have to pick up the rest of that. So just make sure that you're aware of how much the transfer is. The HOA should be able to tell you that. It should be contained in all the documents, but some of that stuff you may not have before you write the contract and do this addendum. So just heads up on that. Paragraph D, deposits for reserves. Buyer shall pay any deposits for reserves required at closing by the association. So this is another money grab for the HOAs. This is what it is, that they're going to require the buyer to add to the reserves so they can continue building those up so they can do capital improvement projects inside of the area that's managed by the HOA. And then E, authorization, paragraph E. Seller authorizes the association to release and provide the subdivision information and any updated resale certificate if requested by the buyer, the title company, or any broker to this sale. If buyer does not require the subdivision information or an updated resale certificate, and the title company requires information from the association, such as the status of dues, special assessments, violation of covenants and restrictions, and a waiver of any right of first refusal, buyer or seller shall pay the title company the cost of obtaining the information prior to title company ordering the information. So in this case, this is just the authorization section so that anybody inside the transaction that has the authority to do so can order this stuff from the HOA. Some HOAs don't like giving out their information to the public. It's only to the residents. Some HOAs have their information out there on the internet for the world to see. This just provides that if it's not out there for the world to see, title, brokers, or anybody inside the transaction can order it, and then clarifies who pays for it should it be required. And then the very last section says, notice to buyer regarding repairs by the association. The association may have the sole responsibility to make certain repairs to the property. If you are concerned about the condition of any part of the property which the association is required to repair, you should not sign the contract unless you are satisfied that the association will make the desired repairs. This is just a catch-all, for the buyer, because some HOAs, depending on how they're set up, maybe they only take care of like the sidewalks and the streets and like the vegetation. And some, you know, maybe it's I say a condo regime. I don't necessarily mean that it's a condo, but it is set up in a situation where they take care of the exterior of the building, or you know, the siding or something like that. I know of a sale that we had a few months ago, and actually it's probably 6 months ago, where the HOA was responsible for repairing the siding. They were also responsible for the foundation of the buildings. And so the buyer had a concern because there were some cracks and they weren't sure if there was foundation issues. And so we kind of had to go back and forth fighting with the HOA about whether they would cover something, whether they thought there was an issue, and stuff like that. So just be aware that if your buyer is concerned about what the HOA is going to cover, that they need to satisfy themselves with whatever the answer to that question is before they sign the contract. So this is it. It's only about 15 minutes. It's a shorter video. Really important. Most important thing of this whole thing is that paragraph A, you need to select 1, 2, or 3. You've got to get your client, your buyer, that subdivision information so that they have everything at their disposal, so they can never come back and say, well, you didn't give me this, or I didn't know I needed this, and blame you for it. So that's it. If you have any questions, post them below. We'll get those answered. Otherwise, stay tuned for the next video.